What's up guys, I'm the ASMR guy, and in today's video I'll be reading some of a book by a very famous author called Roald Dahl. The book is called BFG. I'm sure many of you would have heard of it, but it is still considered to be a classic, so I believe I'll read a couple of chapters because they're very short chapters. They're like 2 or 3 pages long, so I'll probably read about 5 chapters or so. So I hope you enjoy. ASMR Guy. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right on her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off, but it was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room onto her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by on the street. Not the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such a silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this was what they called the witching hour. The witching hour, someone had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep, and all the dark things come out from hiding and have the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of the window and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were ever caught out of bed after the lights out. Even if you said you had been to the lavatory, it was not an acceptable excuse, and they punished you all the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of that. She reached out for her glasses and lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and were very thick. She could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on and slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck beneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everywhere was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong that she couldn't resist it. Quickly, she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village streets, seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked, like houses in a fairy tale. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road, she could see Mrs. Ranch's shop. People, buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about that too. Sophie allowed her eye to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly, she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. Something black. Something tall and black. Something very tall and very black. And very thin. Chapter 2. Who? It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was at least 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall, its head was higher than the upstairs windows of all the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. she crouched, still as a mouse, tingling all over. Chapter 3. The Snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeped out. For a second, her blood froze to ice, and she wanted to scream, but for the second time that night, no sound came out. There, at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came sneaking into the room. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm, the hands, and the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly, the huge hand clamped down over her blanket, and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie crouched underneath the blanket and felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that a monster, or giant, with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes, had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour, and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all the four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized his suitcase and long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared all around her. She saw the village houses rushing past on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast that his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it with one flying stride. Sophie, crouching under the blanket, peered Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. He is going to eat me, she told herself. He'll probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he'll boil me first. Or maybe he'll have me fried. Drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan, sizzling with fat. A blaze of a light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cat